Men have been steadily dropping out of the workforce, especially men aged 25 to 54.
That's a pretty large age range. That could be a number of factors, especially if that leans one way or the other. I'm wondering if they're going to have a finer grain breakdown. If you're 25, you're going to be right out of college. This could be folks who are maybe looking to start their careers, and then there's folks on the edge of this at 54 who are maybe even considering like early retirement. So this is quite a age range that they have in this segment. We'll see how they deal with that later on in this video.
Who are often considered to be in their prime working years. As of August 2024, 13.7% of prime age men were not working, compared to just 7.2% in 1954.
The long-term decline in labor force participation by so-called prime age men is a tremendous worry for our society, for our economy, and probably also for our political system.
There's a surplus of prime age workers who could be working and aren't, and that's this puzzling problem.
The unemployment rate for prime age working men sat at 3.4% in August 2024. This number primarily includes those who are unemployed and looking for a job. But about 10.5% of men in their prime working years, or roughly 6.8 million men nationwide, are neither working nor looking for employment.
That's an interesting point that they just made, which is this doesn't seem to be necessarily focused around the job market itself or how tough it is for folks to find a job at this point in time. They're specifically stating this is a large trend with folks who are not working and not looking for work. This could still be some reference to the job market. I'm not entirely sure how they're determining not looking for work. And so this could be something where wages could have dropped in particular industries, or this could also include folks who had been looking and struggling for some time and have given up the search. So I'll be interested to see if they share more about how they determined what not looking for work meant in this context.
Employment, compared to just 2.5% in 1954.
What's surprising is it's not a COVID phenomenon, it's not a recession phenomenon.
And for every prime age man who is...
Yeah, they just stated that it's not related to those things. Hopefully they'll share more about how they came to that conclusion, so we'll see.
Unemployed and looking for a job, there are more than 3, and some years 4, who are neither working nor looking for work.
So what's driving men out of the workforce? And if left unchecked, what impact will it have on the US economy? Nearly half of prime age men out of the workforce cited obsolete skills, lack of education and training, poor work record, or security issues as a reason preventing them from work.
This makes sense. I think there's been an obvious trend in how many folks are actually going to college in general, especially for folks who are in this prime age group. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that there's actually been somewhat of a downturn in folks attending college in the more recent years, especially with how crazy prices have gotten for getting an education. The fact that inflation is hitting, I'm sure that a number of folks are taking a look at trying to sign themselves up for maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loans and then just opting out of that. But especially for folks who are already in this 25 to 54 age group, for most of that time frame, folks had been year over year generally entering college more and more frequently. So these would definitely be something that would be expected. And even some of those folks maybe even higher education than that. So this could definitely be an impact for their desire and how they feel they would be perceived in the job market. So maybe this is going towards the segment of maybe they are apprehensive of their opportunities in the market. So we'll see where they take this.
Education is a very important predictor of a prime age man's odds of being out of the labor force.
The big impacts are on the non-college educated groups on their ability to enter and stay in the labor market.
Men who are not college educated leave the workforce at higher rates than men who are. At the same time, fewer younger men have been enrolling in college over the past decade.
If you look at the geography of where the most prime age.
Yeah, so they just touched on that point. So they're building this narrative around how folks are dropping out of the market, especially more frequently for folks without a college degree, and also highlighting the fact that folks are going to college less, especially in the most recent decade, and how these two things can play off of each other. But again, this could be related to the fact that maybe these folks aren't seeing the opportunities they would like to be seeing. Maybe they don't have great career growth or career progression that they're hoping for. Maybe monetarily it doesn't make sense for them given all the constraints today. So we'll see how they take this going forward, and especially because the category they're describing here, if it's folks who have just gotten out of college in the last decade, that really shifts that age group that they were just talking about from 25 to 54 years old. Really, that would shrink that down really to the lower end of the spectrum, probably in that 25 to 35-year-old range is the segment that they're currently referencing with this data.
Men out of the labor force are in particular. They tend to be in places that have experienced manufacturing declines. They used to graduate with a high school education.
Okay. Well, they're also going to reference, I'm not too familiar with this area in Ohio, but obviously if there's not going to be a job market in the area that you live, that's going to be a problematic situation for you. Many folks are probably aware, generally if you want to find the best jobs, the most competitive jobs, you're going to want to be in areas where there's a great job market at that point in time. So I'm not sure how job opportunities in these rural areas is going to impact this college degree that they are referencing right now.
And have good, stable jobs. They weren't glamorous jobs. They were, automobile factories, sometimes mines, other manufacturing jobs, but they were respected, they were stable, and they could support a family. Since then.
Yeah. So I'm sure this is probably not going to be a surprise for many folks, which is many jobs I think were considered to be stable and to get what you needed here back in the day. I think obviously everyone has been impacted and has felt inflation, stagnating wage growth. This is where many folks, or at least the perception is that many folks could have a pretty good living, have a home, have a family, have potentially even just one income earner in a family, and have a pretty reasonable job. You don't need to be at the top of the market. You don't have to be in the top 10 percentile of income earners. You could have a normal job, such as one of these, and make a very good living for yourself. But this is also something that certainly is not as true anymore. So again, this is potentially leading up into people's desires and kind of how they're feeling about the market and their desire to enter that market. I'm sure for folks, especially right now, I'm a bit older than these folks. I'd be on the higher end of this recent range. But if I'm 25, just getting out of college, inflation has gone crazy. There's potentially a number of folks looking for jobs, especially in the engineering and tech sector. And I'm one of those folks, and I'm not seeing opportunities. And maybe I can't make as much money as I hoped for, or I would be struggling here. Also, especially if you're taking this out of something that might even be still one of those more ideal jobs. If you're talking about one of these more standard jobs here, especially without a college degree, I'm not sure how somebody would be excited about entering the market with the potential prospect of maybe not even be able to make ends meet. Here, you probably won't be able to get a home at this point in time. Really, any savings is going to be pretty difficult. So maybe this is what they're implying here, is that folks are just not really seeing the upside to entering the market at this point in time.
Due to technology-driven growth, a little bit due to Chinese competition. You've had a lot of manufacturing firms and the places where they were located that were one-horse towns become ghost lands, right?
Wages could also be a contributing factor. Median annual wages for men with a
Yeah, so this is what I was just mentioning, which is generally speaking, even in this chart, you're even seeing that the annual income is actually going down in this chart. So this is where, um, in relative dollars. And so this is where basically the upside to any work at all is going to be worse at this point in time compared to the 50 years ago that they're referencing. So this is definitely tough. And obviously, you see that these folks who have less education are looking at even smaller numbers here over time. And so if you're entering the job market with maybe just a high school diploma, you're going to be looking at some relatively low wages. Here they're showing it between the 60K and 30K. This is probably somewhere around the 45K mark. That's not a lot. I know in some markets you could easily have $3,000 plus a month in rent. And so basically that's like 80-90% of these folks' salaries that could be happening here. So that leaves very little room to do anything else. So that's not necessarily an exciting prospect to some of these folks in this range. And I actually see that they have shrunk this age group somewhat similar to what I had mentioned, which is 25 to 34 in this case. So this is actually referencing the newer entrants to the market, the younger folks who are just at the start of their career, potentially looking ahead and not particularly optimistic about what that could mean for them and why they would sign up for maybe a full-time job with so few prospects or upsides to them putting in that time, putting in that effort from their perspective at the moment.
high school diploma have fallen from just over $57,600 in 1973 to $45,000 in 2023, adjusted for inflation. At the same time, wages for those with a bachelor's degree or more have increased by about $6,300 during the same period.
That's actually pretty interesting. So folks with a bachelor's degree or more are actually seeing real wage growth. So this really is focusing in, this is why they're setting up this data around college attendance, is that the number of folks who are entering the market at this potentially 45,000 mark are actually a growing percentage of the incoming workforce, which makes sense. This is certainly a tough time for these folks who are potentially looking to enter the market, and this is potentially how they're going to take this, which is the upside is not necessarily there for these folks as they want to enter the market, and so they're just choosing not to participate.
This decline in earnings led to a 44% growth in the exit rate of men without a college degree from the workforce between 1980 and 2019.
I think, honestly, status plays more of a role than wages. As I said before, you had a manufacturing job, it was respected, you were part of a community, breadwinner for your family, you had organizations like unions or Rotary clubs that surrounded your job, and that's gone.
In general, men without children are also less likely to participate in the workforce compared to men with children.
Yeah, well, that certainly makes sense. I'm sure if you have another person who's reliant on you, you're going to be much more inclined to go and enter the workforce regardless of the upside, just because you're going to need extra cash. I think if you're somebody who doesn't have any children and you're in this younger side, you could and probably should be thinking about living at home with your parents, trying to minimize your expenses overall. And if you live very frugally, especially if you're somebody who's living with their parents and you have that type of opportunity to do so, you could be living off of a very small amount of income or money at all at that point in time, if you really need anything, depending on how much your family could be supporting you in that case. Whereas I'm sure your parents or your family members or friends are not going to be signing up to support you and a child. You're going to need more space. You're going to need more of everything, really. So you don't have anyone else you can probably rely on as you start to make that transition. You're going to have to become self-sufficient, even if those prospects aren't as good.
Especially men without education or training after high school.
What we have seen is a huge rise in the proportion of prime-age men who've never been married, and a very, very significant decline in the proportion who are currently married and have kids at home. And those two trends track closely with the big changes that we've seen about male attachment in the labor force. Correlation isn't always causation, but looking at that correspondence is real important.
They seem to be trying to make a point here that because folks aren't getting married as much and they're not having kids as much at this age group, that's why they're not entering the market. I'm not sure if I'm really believing that segment. I would say for myself, if I'm putting myself in the shoes of one of these folks, I'm potentially having 45,000 a year as income. That's before taxes. That's before any living expenses, before car payments, any of that. It's going to be tough to want to do anything really at that point. And really getting married or having children, you're hopefully going to want to have some level of stability in your life in order to do that. And so this could just be, they seem to be going at it the other way here. Maybe they'll expand on that and why they're thinking that way. But for me, it's really coming from the other end, which is if you're not positive of your prospects, you're not positive on your future, why are you going to get married? Why are you going to have kids? And so they seem to be going backwards in this, in my mind, but we'll see if they add some more data behind this.
Meanwhile, 57% of the roughly 10% of men not looking for work said their physical or mental health was the main reason for not being employed, with 55% citing a disability, serious illness, and or receiving disability benefits.
The whole question about the health and the mental health of male workforce dropouts is an extremely important and I think concerning one. Distressing proportion of the men who are out of the workforce say they're using pain medications every day.
A 2017 research paper estimates that an increase in opioid prescription between 1999 to 2015 led to about 43% of the decline in men's labor force participation rate during that period.
So then you have to ask, what sort of pain are we talking about? Are we talking about physical pain? Are we talking about metaphysical pain? There's an enormous amount of depression, mental health challenges that men in this grouping face. Some of this is a chicken and egg question. Did you drop out because you were feeling sad, or are you sad because you dropped out and you're living on the couch?
Unemployment is really terrible.
There's an interesting point that they made there. I feel like they kind of walked back what they just said a little bit. They seem to be making the point that a sizable number of these folks are potentially injured or disabled, and then also seem to be implying that like maybe this is a mentality thing. It's a little odd. I thought that they were just about to start tracking potentially how these folks are disabled or potentially negatively impacted by some factor are the ones who are most impacted by this, which makes a lot of sense. But then towards the end there, he seemed to start sort of questioning folks and how they got into that state to begin with, which was not what I thought he was going to be doing there.
For people's well-being. Often people adapt to all kinds of negative shocks, losing a kid, being widowed, whatever, and eventually kind of come back. But long-term unemployment is one of the worst things in terms of that. So what you have is a kind of scarring effect, and it's worse for men because their identity is much more wrapped up in their role as a worker.
I could see that. Again, they seem to be going away from this departure of the data they just showed, which is interesting to me because they just put so much effort into highlighting the opioids that were going out. Presumably, there's obviously the crisis that has just recently happened, but hopefully most of these folks, they said, were disabled and impacted by this or potentially injured. These folks have legitimate cause to not be in the market, and they seem to be shifting it over to kind of like this mentality. um, version of why folks are not doing it. I know for myself, I do agree with the point that my job is definitely a big portion of what I have derived my identity around. I think that's likely a common view. I'm not sure exactly how that gets set up for particular genders, but I know for folks who, especially if you've put in a lot of time in your career at this point, you're trying to make the best out of your life. It's hard to separate which part of you is your job and which part of you is outside of work. And making sure that you have those things well separated is definitely a challenge that I know even I struggle with.
Men's declining workforce participation can potentially leave a lasting impact on the American economy.
It means slower growth of the economy, obviously. It means bigger wealth gaps within our society.
It certainly will have an impact on our productivity and probably already is.
The U.S. has been experiencing a severe shortage in labor, still missing 1.7 million Americans from the workforce compared to February 2020. The McKinsey Global Institute estimates that U.S. GDP could have been $296 to $442 billion higher in 2023.
It's an interesting number that they have here. It seems to be an odd projection. I would say here there could be an essence of supply and demand for the workforce at this point, which is if folks aren't particularly excited, which they have said themselves of there's low jobs, this means that folks aren't actually that interested in paying all that well for folks to enter the market. It seems to be odd that they're taking that stance and also highlighting the fact that GDP could have grown a sizable portion if these folks had been in the market. If anything, this should probably speak to the fact that employers or the market should be paying better and incentivizing folks to enter the market if something like this was possible. And so at this point, it's either a situation where this type of growth for the GDP wouldn't have been possible because the companies themselves didn't believe that much growth was there ahead of them, and that's why they offered lower salaries, was because they didn't believe they had that much return on their investment. Otherwise, every company is going to want to make as much money as humanly possible. If you could tell a company in here going from about 300 billion to about 450, let's say, that's about a 50% growth that we're talking about here. So any company or any employer that I know would gladly have a 50% growth in their company over this time frame, and likely they would have paid higher salaries if they thought it was possible for them to achieve this at that time. And so again, this seems to be an interesting way of portraying this, but that might be potentially unrealistic.
If the country had been able to fill its job vacancies. However, some experts suggest the impacts of men leaving or never entering the workforce could be more sector-specific.
You need young men coming in wanting to replace those people going out. And so if men have primarily been in more manual labor, more blue-skilled and skilled trades, if they're older and they're leaving into retirement and there's not as many young men coming in, both because of declining cohort sizes, but moving in a different direction type of careers, we're going to be losing that sector of productivity.
Despite a steep rise in federal funding, the infrastructure sector hasn't been able to find enough workers, with the construction workforce shortage surpassing 500,000 in 2024.
We are a little concerned about the impact that inflation is going to have and has had on the movement.
So now they're entering into the labor market here, and those folks who are these jobs presumably have a lot of physical labor involved with it. That definitely makes sense for me. If you're saying I'm not going to get paid that well, or even less than folks who were doing these jobs 50 years ago, and I'm 25, 26, why would I want to sign up to do a very physically intensive job? Many of these jobs, I would say, are going to be less safe than doing like a desk job. So why would you potentially risk your physical well-being, put in presumably a lot more physical effort for sure than many jobs that are getting paid more for potentially less incentive than they could have when their parents or their grandparents did that job? That definitely makes a lot of sense to me. I'm not sure who would want to sign up for that. I'm sure the folks who are making this video probably wouldn't want to sign up for doing these very labor intensive jobs for a fraction of the pay that they're currently making.
Of infrastructure dollars into the actual productive activity. Having a shortage of men in construction is going to raise a problem.
The trend could have a dire sociopolitical impact as well.
It'll get worse in ways that we would not like. I mean, I think it would lead to more premature deaths, but it will also likely lead to radicalization and polarization, because this is a frustrated, left behind group with no options.
There are problems that govern.
Not sure how they were. So I understand that second point of, if you feel like there's no opportunities for you to the point where you don't even think it's worth getting a job because of how low the return is for you and the incentive for you to enter that job, definitely I see that. You're going to be frustrated at society, at maybe yourself, maybe at others who have these other opportunities. That's certainly going to be a frustrating stance. I'm not really sure about that first comment. She seemed to imply something about whether or not folks would be impacted for how they were living, or whether or not they would have like a preemptive death or something like that. I'm not entirely sure what she was mentioning there. I'm not sure if I'm following that exactly. Maybe they'll get into that more, but they are switching categories here, so potentially not.
Government can address and problems that government can't address.
So one of the first functions that beats out policy is economic growth. You have a strong economy, you're going to have increased wage structure, and it's going to bring people back into the market.
More than a quarter of prime-age men not looking for work cited insufficient pay as a reason preventing.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that took them a while to get here, but obviously that's going to be a huge reason. If you don't feel like you're going to get paid appropriately for the time that you're putting in, why would you sign up to do that work? I know I wouldn't be as inclined to do so.
Them from work. And nearly half said competitive pay, salary, compensation, and or bonuses was a very important factor when considering whether to enter or...
Yeah, obviously. I'm sure there's a number of folks who work just because they love their job and they have found the perfect opportunity for them somewhere and it aligns with their values and their goals. But I'm sure for many of us, a key reason why you go to work is to get paid, especially when you're talking about these generalizations of any portion of society entering the labor force. Is they want to get paid. That's the entire point. That's why you enter the market. Obviously, you're going to want to be paid competitively for you to do that work. The companies are paying you for a reason, which is they're going to get some value out of you, and so you're going to want to get some value out of them in return.
Or return to the workforce.
For the young, better training, skills training, better some form of post-high school education, encouraging that, maybe even subsidizing that. I think part of the youth mental health crisis has to do with what's next. What's AI going to do? What am I going to do? Are there any stable jobs? I can't afford college. All those questions all come together. And so models that help them kind of give them a jump start can be really effective ways of intervening. And there are actually now really promising programs in high school.
Well, this is great to see. I think likely for many folks who've already been through high school, I wish that there was more financial literacy classes there. I know it took quite a bit of time for myself to learn some of these things well into my late 20s and early 30s. And so being able to understand how financial aspects of your life can impact you, and not just the short term, but the long term. There's so many folks getting crazy amounts of credit cards or debt or pay later options, and this is going to definitely negatively impact you. And being able to cover these things early on, so that way folks never even sign up for these things that they shouldn't be dabbling in, will hopefully help folks a lot. But again, they seem to be kind of covering a variety of aspects here. They seem to have covered how, I want to say it was 50-something% they highlighted were disabled or potentially injured to some extent earlier in the video, which are things that would actually be preventing them from entering the workforce. And then they just highlighted like 28% for folks not being interested in entering the market due to options. So it's unclear exactly how they're trying to add this all up together, but they actually seem to be hyper focusing in on this financial portion. And again, I'm not sure how financial literacy is going to help somebody who doesn't feel like they have opportunities in the job market. If anything, this will make it potentially more apparent to them. Maybe they're going to describe something of like, maybe this will incentivize folks to get college degrees more often potentially and shift that trend that has been started recently. So that way they have a higher potential. But I think this is great in general. I hope more folks get financial literacy courses, especially earlier on. But I'm not sure exactly how this is going to tie back into their overall statements and the outcome that they believe is the problem here.
Schools, which teach kids financial literacy. They teach them about equitable entrepreneurship. They teach them about how do you foster better mental health as part of the workplace. And it seems to inspire kids to go on to college, right? Because they sort of see a pathway where they didn't see it before.
I see. So they are basically highlighting this as maybe if we inform folks and maybe they have a better sense of what their opportunities would be in the future, depending on which path they take, maybe they would be more inclined to go to college. But while I think helping coach folks on mental health and financial literacy, especially in middle school or high school, as they mentioned, is great. I love that. I hope we do more of that. There's not really addressing the obvious elephant in the room, in my opinion, which is who's going to sign themselves up for hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt at that young of an age is definitely a tough decision for so many folks. And they also seem to be referencing this alongside this construction worker shortage, which is an odd comparison. I don't believe that they're making the case that you need a college degree in order to have that job. So they also seem to be highlighting the fact that the open market seems to be this other area that you don't need college degrees for, but they're also highlighting that they believe the solution is getting more college degrees and then not actually satisfying that gap in the labor force.
29% of men out of the labor force said that training and educational programs was another important factor in considering a return to the workforce.
Having the type of commitment from the employer to train and retain and offer upward mobility for workers, I think will be very important. Trying to figure out more about career pathways in the labor market and not just the education side. So how is it that someone moves from first job, next job to best job? How do we help people understand and navigate?
Nearly a quarter of working Americans said they weren't satisfied with their growth opportunities in the workplace. Compared to other OECD countries that on average spend 0.1% of their GDP on training their workers, the US spent only 0.03% of their GDP on job training in 2022.
Yeah, that's definitely a pretty small portion. To some extent, it makes sense. We're capitalistic society. Why is your employer incentivized to help train you and spend money on training you as an employee to potentially get more money out of them when they might be getting 80% of the value from you in your current job, maybe at like 50 or 60% of the salary that they're paying you or would pay you compared to that ideal job for you. I'm not really sure the incentive is there for the employer, and that's why it's not happening, which is I'm not sure how many employers are aiming to pay their employees better. Obviously, if that were the case, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in now. Most employers are going to want to pay folks as little as possible to maximize their profits as a business. But also us as employees are going to care more about how much we can earn. So obviously we want the opposite, which is we want to make as much money as possible for the amount of effort that we give and the amount of value we give to our employers. So this is a give and take on sort of negotiations here, and how good the market is definitely going to impact these things over time.
Older age groups, it's tougher. You're probably not going to get these guys to retrain, but there are a lot of programs that have largely been pioneered in the UK, much more than here, but we're starting to pick up on them. that literally just try and reboot community activities. They get these isolated people in despair out of their houses. It can make a difference.
It sounds nice, I would say, if that were possible, but that sounds like an oversimplification of it. I'm not sure if if you just have a random community event that suddenly all those folks who are isolating themselves are going to enter that event. Obviously, if these are the folks who are feeling somewhat scorned by society and they don't feel like they have the opportunities, they're likely not even paying attention to these events that are going to be happening in their communities. They showed, I guess, potentially some volunteer work there as an option, as an event, but I'm not sure how many of these events that these folks would be looking for, especially if you're a person who's not working at this point in time. Potentially volunteering is not likely high on your to-do list. You're likely figuring out what you're doing with your life, maybe your potential prospects, how you're going to shift focus to potentially be looking to volunteer for other folks. And if that was just kind of a visual aspect of showing these volunteer programs, not every event is going to be free. And so you're probably also not actively looking for events that could potentially cost you money when you're not earning anything. So this just seems to be a large oversimplification of if you build it, they will come. And that isn't always the case.
Social programs like disability benefits spark contentious debate.
It's very controversial. People have very strong opinions about this. While we don't know why it is happening, we can be pretty clear that the social welfare programs are helping, and the disability programs are helping to finance this situation in a way.
Yeah, they seem to be confused here about how programs that are helping folks who are struggling are helping the situation, when they literally said earlier in the video that the vast majority of the folks in this category are actually disabled folks or other folks who are having some type of ailment that is preventing them from entering the market. And so they seem to have spent a good chunk of this video actually talking about folks' desire to enter the market, how competitive salaries are, when that was only about a third. That was practically half of the disabled segment that they referenced. And so obviously programs that are meant to help folks who are in that situation, for those folks who are most at need, are obviously going to be positively impacted by this. I'm not sure where the confusion is that they're highlighting here.
Way that was never originally intended.
A 2018 analysis.
I'm going to have to watch that again. Did they say in ways that it was not intended?
And the disability programs are helping to finance this situation in a way that was never originally intended.
Yeah, that's odd. I'd assume the entire point of disability programs is to help folks who are disabled. Presumably they're working exactly as intended, which is if you are struggling, you are getting help while you're in that situation. If you are a needy member of society, that's what hopefully ideally society is here for, is that we help the folks who are most in need. And those folks who are most in need in the scenario, as they mentioned themselves through that data earlier, are receiving that help. So obviously that should be the intended purpose. I'm not sure why it wouldn't be intended for the folks who need this support are getting the support.
A 2018 analysis by the Joint Economic Committee found that 64% of prime-age men who aren't working were receiving some sort of government assistance.
So the one benefit that they rely heavily on is disability insurance. One, because they often are unable to work if they're...
Yeah, exactly. They seem to be covering this point again, which is, I'm sure government programs are not willy-nilly handing out disability for folks who are not actually disabled. I guess that'd be a whole other segment. But if you're a disabled individual and you're getting support from the government, that's the point. That's how it's supposed to be. Like, that's the entire reason why folks who are working are paying taxes, etc., to go towards those folks who aren't able to. So this seems to be working exactly as intended here. So it's odd that that last individual stated that he was confused. And this lady here is basically highlighting the fact that it should be, is what I believe her point is.
have a physical injury or high levels of addiction or whatever. But it also provides health insurance, which is huge.
Very much against the initial intentions of the founders of the program. They've ended.
I'm not sure if they seem to be clipping these two individuals back to back, seeming to make a point, but I'm not sure if these two individuals are actually trying to make the same point. Like, at least my perspective again, if you're disabled, you should definitely have access to healthcare. I'm not sure if this guy is saying that he doesn't believe disabled people should have access to healthcare when they're not able to work. That seems like an odd stance that he'd be taking. And also, they seem to be kind of clipping these folks back to back, where I'm not sure this is the point the lady is making here in this video. But I guess we'll see where they take this.
Ended up with a perverse situation that too often subsidizes or even incentivizes helplessness and long-term dependence. If we thought about a system in which we had a work-first principle where the incentives were for getting the training and then showing up at the job and then staying at the job, I think we'd be in a lot better place than we are.
Yeah, definitely not a fan of the take this guy's having here, which is obviously folks who can work are going to try to work. At least that's my belief. I'm sure all of us are aware or know somebody who potentially might not enter this category, but I'm sure it's a very small portion of folks. I certainly want to believe myself that there's a large portion of folks who are using these programs legitimately, and I believe from past data that I've seen that that is the case, that there's actually a very small fraction where fraud or anything like that is being used, and often media kind of like overemphasizes this because this can be like a polarizing issue for folks. And I'm not really sure. I would say, even for myself, I would say in the workforce, I barely see folks who are disabled in my day-to-day work. I think I've worked for a number of years, and very rarely have I seen any disabled individual in the workforce alongside me. So I'm not sure how great the market is for disabled individuals, even if they had the ability to work with the disability that they have. This individual seems to be having the stance that these folks are potentially undeserving of this benefit, maybe that they should be attempting harder to work. I'm not really sure what point he's trying to make here, other than saying this like work first mentality. So he seems to be coming from it as they should just be working, like just get the job done. So that seems to be a pretty strong stance from somebody who I'm assuming is not disabled. That seems to be an easy way of saying, maybe they're just not trying hard enough. Maybe they just aren't putting in the effort, but that seems to be a stance that he can have because he's not in that situation. I'm sure it's easier to say from his perspective than it is for the folks who might be experiencing these things.
However, some experts remain doubtful about whether altering the benefits program will lead to meaningful results.
I think until we deal with the deeper problem of ill health, ill mental health, these guys aren't going to respond to incentives.
Yeah, I'm much more aligned with what this lady is describing, which is like, we should definitely be making sure folks get support. I think we should make sure folks who are disabled get the support that they need. We should also make sure that folks who don't have opportunities to go to college, potentially because it's prohibitive for them, especially with all the exorbitant prices nowadays, that they have opportunities to train and grow and have career opportunities in the future. And I think all those things are great things that we should be doing and that we should be putting in place as a society in order to help those folks who don't have those opportunities. There's nothing saying that somebody who doesn't have the opportunity today can't do something great with it. I'm sure there's a lot of untapped potential in folks who just don't have the opportunities that many other folks have. And I agree with what she was saying. We should be looking to help support those. But I guess we'll see what this guy has to say about it.
Everybody is responsible for their brothers. Everybody's responsible for their neighbors and their friends. And we ourselves as citizens can help to shine a spotlight on this.
Okay, that's not where I thought he was going. For what seemed to be his stance of basically like, suck it up, get into the job force. It's interesting that he basically ended on we should all be helping each other, especially considering like literally the previous portion was him just describing how these folks should just kind of deal with it and get in, start working. So it's an odd stance that he had there at the end.
It shouldn't be America's invisible problem. And the more that we talk about it, the more that we pay attention to it, the closer we get to turning this around.
Well, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed what you saw here. I'll see you around.